All right. Hello, everyone. I'm John Knox from MedTechConnect.net, and I'm here with Ery Anguiano. Hopefully, I pronounced that correctly. He is the founder of Apsis Consulting Group. He has more than 16 years of industry experience, and he's here to tell us a bit about regulatory due diligence 101, basically an introduction to how to think about regulations impact on medtech and health startups. This is kind of a focus for investors, but the same information is useful for founders as well. For this stuff, you have the same things at stake, right? Both investors and the founder want their company to be successful and not have regulators like the FDA shut down their operation and put them out of business or create lots and lots of expensive problems that need to be fixed later. This promises to be a pretty interesting presentation. I got a preview of it. I look forward to hearing everything that Ery has to say. Ery, you want to go?
Thank you, John, for the introduction and also for setting this up. Yes, I'll go ahead and screen share now. Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody, for attending today. We're going to be discussing a topic that doesn't always get a whole lot of view or insight or eyeballs on it. However, it's something that I am personally passionate about, and the team that I put together, the team that we've worked with, have found some opportunities for improvement over the course of working with 50 plus startups over the years. First things first, just a quick introduction. My name is Ery Anguiano. I am the founder and principal consultant of Apsis Consulting Group. We are a small boutique consulting firm specializing in regulatory affairs for MedTech devices, specifically in the US market, so US FDA. I personally come from an engineering background and 16 plus years of specialized support in regulatory strategy. I've worked with large-scale manufacturers early in my career in the quality sphere, product development, materials analysis, and material support. And the last 10 years or so have been focused more on regulatory strategy for MedTech startups and digital health startups. Currently, I also work with federally funded innovation programs such as ARPA-H, NIH's NHLBI Catalyze program. These are accelerator programs designed to help new advancing MedTech technology specifically to path appropriately and accelerate their development and go to market. So just a little bit about myself. There's three of us total in the firm, former FDA regulator, as well as a medical doctor. And between the three of us, we bring about 50 years of experience in medical devices. Well, today we're going to take a look at regulatory due diligence, specifically due diligence itself from an investment perspective with MedTech companies does receive a considerable amount of attention and effort. Regulatory due diligence, in our conversations with investors, we found that many admit that they don't really give the attention necessary to analyzing regulatory diligence. Many times they'll take the startup's word for it. Not that necessarily that's a bad thing, but there are blind spots that occur that we've seen repeatedly over the course of investment decisions that could have been avoided. And we're going to look at some specific case studies to look at what those blind spots look like, what the potential outcome can be from overlooking regulatory diligence. So a couple of items that we'll be talking about specifically. What does regulatory diligence mean? So predict the likely FDA path of your device. How do we do that? We'll be analyzing how to look at claims, how to look at intended use, get an early estimation of the regulatory burden for your device. Also, what does the evidence architecture look like for the startup's evidence plan? And what does that mean? So what is the evidence burden that will be required to bring this device to market? And how does that evidence burden relate to the runway that they need, the capital investments that they need, and how can you protect your investment specifically? We'll look at how to spot claim drift early. Some of the examples that we'll look at today are companies that entered unauthorized markets through subtle claim expansions or understanding of wellness versus treatment. We'll learn some lessons from that as well. And like I said, we'll look at some real failures and some decisions that were made, but we'll analyze it in the context of risk analysis. So how does understanding the regulatory risk that your particular device has, your particular investment target has, how can you make decisions around that risk that protect the value of the company? So that's what we'll look at. First things first, a little bit of information in terms of venture capital and how it relates to our topic here. So the venture capital is real, of course. This report from JP Morgan just came out yesterday, so I was able to update my numbers here. So we have the latest and greatest for 2025. So in 2025, $11.3 billion were deployed into MedTech. You could see the trend line there over the the course of the last 5 years. And although the general trend is down, there's still significant capital being deployed globally. More than 323 deals public between seed and Series A VC deal activity, 113 with a total value of 1.9 billion. If you were to average it out, and maybe average isn't the best metric here, but average certainly gives us an understanding of where we lie. 16 million from an average check between seed and Series A. Significant capital gets deployed at a single point of time during these investment decisions. So how do you protect those decisions, and where is that capital being deployed? A particular shift in 2025 based on that same JP Morgan assessment and others that have come out recently shows that a lot of the capital this year, or last year I should say, 65% in essence went to Series B and later stage companies. So what does that mean exactly? Well, I'm not an investor, but this really shows, or you can make the assumption here that a lot of capital is being spent on players that are a sure bet, less risk or more risk-averse investments. 9.3 billion of those were Series B or later stages. A Series B company tends to be fairly mature in terms of a device, in terms of a product pipeline, therefore is less risk considerably. 70% of the investment rounds were Series B or later. So that gives us an understanding of, although a good 30% are earlier, how do you protect those earlier investments if what you're looking for as an investor is that less risk, higher potential for reward analysis? So how do you manage that risk from earlier stage companies? Taking a look at some earlier stage companies, like we mentioned before, 1.9 billion of that went to seed and Series A investment rounds. The median round from our best available sources is 3.5 million, and approximately 118 hours investment decision go into investment in VC diligence time. So it's a considerable amount of diligence. Keeping that in mind, allocating 0.5 to 2% of the check size to diligence, and specifically a portion of that to regulatory diligence, seems like a pretty cheap insurance to me. But what do you get from looking at that cheap insurance, so to speak? We'll look at that later, what sort of return you can get for that cheap insurance. But in general, the early rounds are big enough so that they warrant some protection of your investment capital. So let's take a look at that. First, let's analyze, what do we mean by regulatory due diligence? Regulatory due diligence 101, as we're kind of framing this discussion, refers to the investor's skill of predicting the MedTech product's US FDA regulatory path. Of course, that can be expanded into other territories as well, but analyzing what is the likely path, what is the likely timeline, and what is the likely commercialization pathway and opportunity for a particular target. It involves analyzing all of the aspects that go into marketing to that first customer, which is the FDA. If you're in the medical device realm, if you don't get past that FDA when required, that FDA hurdle, you can't sell. How do you protect that, your investment, so that all the obstacles are minimized to the point where you feel comfortable making an investment? But first, let's look at what's in scope of our discussion today and what's out of scope. We understand that regulatory VC diligence in general encompasses a wide array of different topics, different analyses. And as an investor, you're no doubt an expert in analyzing even the intangibles that go into a founder team, an idea. So what's out of scope is the TAM, SAM, SOM segmentation, positioning. Reimbursement is a big part of the discussion in general diligence, but we're not going to be discussing that today. Those warrant their own webinar series, as well as financial modeling, valuation, term sheets. That's all out of scope. What is in scope is the primary ingredients to be able to go to market and, like I said, pass your first customer, which is the FDA. So what do your claims look like? What's your intended use? What is the intended marketing language that you're going to frame around that device? What does your pathway look like? Are you a class 1, a class 2, class 3? Which of the most common pathways will you use? And what does that mean for your overall runway and capital investment needs? And what does your evidence plan look like? Specifically, what does the target's evidence plan look like? Is it fully baked out? Have they considered the items that they need to consider? Or are there some pretty heavy blind spots that they haven't considered yet? We'll be looking at that specifically. Just to note that there are other paradigms in investment diligence that are all equally important, but we won't be talking about those today. We understand that regulatory diligence is one portion of that overall diligence that needs to be done during an investment decision. However, we'll see that regulatory diligence can be a make or break switch for your target's overall success. So what are some common myths and assumptions that we see on a day-to-day basis regarding regulatory that create uncertainty and destroy value. One of the myths, and we'll go into it in a little bit detail based on what we've seen in the last couple of days from the FDA, but the wellness exemption. We'll see a couple of examples of companies that have made wrong decisions in terms of wellness and have thought that disclaimers in general can keep you within that realm and outside of the FDA's purview. But we'll see how you really have to challenge those claims and understand the exact verbiage and wording that you need to look at for that to be true. Some companies that we've seen, and not just in our examples today, but in general, plan to have a launch of a product. They say, well, we'll figure out FDA later. In many cases, they wrongly assume that their device is not a medical device and does not require FDA clearance. That is a big myth that can destroy value, can cost a lot of money to remediate, and cost a lot of time. Another myth, 510K is the default pathway. Sometimes 510K is not your best pathway, but understanding the risks involved in the timeline and the opportunities from a business standpoint and from a regulatory standpoint of your other options, I think is a necessary diligence question that should be answered. Other times we meet with founders that are clinicians, specialists, medical doctors that are world-class in their field. Before we even speak to them, they've already conducted, significant pilot data, significant amount of studies. They've sunk a lot of money into these clinical studies. But the way the clinical studies were designed, they can't be used for submission. So what happens? In some cases, they have to repeat clinical studies because they didn't design those correctly with the FDA in mind. These are common assumptions that we see, and these all destroy value. So having an early question to what a startup is looking at for these specific items is something that can protect your investment long term. So what does a diligence look like? All regulatory professionals have a different flavor of how they perform regulatory diligence, but this is the spine that we've worked with and have seen some great results. In general, everybody must do something like this. But we look at the claims and the intended use of the device, first of all. Those claims and intended use, sometimes you have different opportunities within the claims and intended use, lead to different classifications and different pathways. We'll take a look at more of that a little bit later. Those different classifications, different pathways have different evidence burdens. Some minute, some extraordinary. So depending on what you claim, you can have a very quick path to market or a very difficult, turbulent, and expensive path to market. It's necessary to look at your design controls, how the startup or the target is understanding and approaching design, and then what are they thinking in terms of their marketing. I can't tell you how many times I've seen startups that make some fantastic claims because of their belief in their technology. And that's fantastic. But the claims that they're making to investors early on, those aren't reasonable. Or they have such long lead times or such a difficult pathway that they're probably not the best first product for that startup. Understanding that can give investors a huge leg up when they're making these decisions. So why are claims important? Step one, claims, what a startup claims in their marketing language, in their intended use, and their indications for use. Not only is it a legal construct, they are legally required, they're held to certain legal requirements based on their indications for use, based on what the intended use is. But also it crafts the marketing language that you can draw around that. What can you say? What can you not say? Marketing claims are dealt with very, very seriously from an FDA's perspective. The FDA looks at what is the device's intent and what are the users going to understand from your marketing language. And if that marketing language puts users or patients at risk, then the FDA can have problems. And that's when you result in warning letters or additional information requests. All of that goes into your intended use and marketing claims. We discussed, but let's level set with everybody here. The different pathway discussions that we had just mentioned. This is a little cheat sheet for you seasoned investors and founders. This is remedial, but it's good to always to level set. 510K pathway, of course, is a easier, much desired regulatory pathway by many because it provides a quicker path to market. You are essentially demonstrating equivalence to an already marketed device. Therefore, your risk profile is equal. FDA tends to move those applications forward fairly quickly as long as you meet the required benchmarks. De novo, when you have no predicate that you can go off of, meaning your intended use is different to any existing marketed medical device, or your technology is such that different questions of safety and efficacy arise because of your device, then a de novo pathway is likely going to be required. That tends to be for low and moderate risk devices, but the pathway is a little bit longer. And understanding what that pathway looks like and what the time looks like and what the capital requirements look like is something that an investor should know. Lastly, for high-risk devices, life-sustaining implantables, the PMA process is something that many try to avoid. Sometimes they can't be avoided, just nature of the device that you've designed, but understanding what that process looks like and equally timeline, capital requirements is something that should be on the board from an investment perspective. Let's take a look at another way to view how claims relate to this pathway and classification. A very similar or the same technology can have different levels of risk from the FDA standpoint. A certain technology, for example, that measures oxygenation for a fitness device could be a wellness device. You're measuring oxygen saturation, but you're doing it in the context of fitness and wellness overall, not for medical reasons. But when that oxygenation includes now alarms, you're monitoring with a medical intent, you're triaging, you're making high-risk decisions like a diagnosis or a clinical decision. The ladder of claims increases your risk depending on what exactly you claim. And as we mentioned, feeds directly into the pathway and directly into the evidence burden, capital requirements, and the timeline, even if it's the exact same device. From a technological standpoint, if it looks like the same device. It's easy to drift when you're drafting marketing language, but you want to always keep in mind where exactly you are on the risk claim ladder here. For this reason, I am a big fan of what is normally called product road mapping. So understanding the different products that can result from the same implementation of the technology, just based on different claims, different alerts, different diagnoses, different wordings that come from that same device. Some of the startups that we've supported have some fantastic AI automation, life-sustaining opportunity. They can provide oxygen, they can auto-titrate, they can use AI to alert, notify, provide decisions. The technology is very impressive. But many of our startups that we've worked with start with a more simple product for your market entry, sometimes a monitoring product, for example. Why is that important? There's a lot of factors that go into that, but timeline is one, capital requirements is another. Many utilize the capital to work through the manufacturing issues for the device. First of all, sell it, put it in people's hands, obtain information, gather information, real world data. That real world data then goes into a version 2 or a version 3 device that progressively have a higher claim status, a higher risk status based on the claims. One device could be monitoring. The technology could be used for monitoring. Then you can put alerts, thresholds, notifications. That tends to be a higher risk endeavor and has higher evidence burdens. Then, depending on the available data that you've collected over V1 and V2, many times the same technology can be used to make a diagnostic decision or as a diagnostic aid. Obviously, the risk goes up. The foundation of V1 and V2, the data that you've collected, allows you to easily make that jump and to initiate that product through a different pathway. This has been a ladder that has worked well for many startups and continues to be used. And this is something that we definitely promote and propose when the technology can be used for different claims and for different end uses at the end of the day. But understanding your product roadmap is something from an investment standpoint that allows you to see what is realistic. Is V3 realistic in 18 months or is V1 realistic in 12 months? Understanding what those requirements are, how difficult or how easy it is to get through the FDA will allow you to make a better decision from an investment standpoint and truly understand your risk. So what's reasonable to expect from a startup now that we've discussed a little bit of diligence? Obviously, the maturity of the startup has a lot to do with the expectations that you would have from a regulatory diligence standpoint. Pre-seed, seed, Series A, they're different maturities from a startup perspective. And as we noticed at the beginning of our discussion, a lot of investment money is going into startups that are mature, that have de-risked a lot of those early phases, early stages. Pre-seed, seed, and Series A obviously carry more risks. But if you understand and do the diligence appropriately, maybe you can mitigate a lot of those risks or help your target mitigate those risks as well. From a pre-seed perspective, if you've locked your claim boundaries and understand the technology, that even if it's not fully well designed, if it's not complete, you don't know exactly the type of validation, you don't know exactly the performance will be, but understanding your claim boundaries, the general path that you'll need to take the different opportunities within the FDA pathways that you may have, that's a good indication that they've done their regulatory homework. Seed level, you should be looking at an established credible pathway, an evidence plan. What evidence do you need to establish that pathway? And what are your labeling claims? What are your marketing claims? What can you realistically claim based on the plan that you've developed? And how long should that take? Those are reasonable questions to ask at that level. Series A, many Series A companies already have validated and submitted and approved or cleared their first one or two devices. Maybe it's a V1 version of the technology they've implemented. So the level of maturity and regulatory understanding should be a lot higher. Your quality management system should be operating, and the expectations and road mapping from that regulatory team should be well developed. Different expectations for different maturity of companies is something that you should factor in as well. So with that in mind, something that we do and we've found very, very helpful is to really limit the level of diligence for depending on the maturity of the target or the startup. Sometimes you just need a snapshot. We've developed our own internal AI agent that helps us do a snapshot within 24 hours. What do you get there, or what should you see from a snapshot perspective for very early stage companies? You should have a good understanding of what your claims can be, what they shouldn't be. You should have a good hypothesis on your pathway. You should have risks identified. What are some potential risks? What are those risks? Well, if you should know at that point whether you'll need to perform a clinical study or not. Clinical studies can range between $1 to $4 million. So that's a huge capital investment that you should know early on based on your claims. And you should have a good understanding of the regulatory landscape. How are your competitors regulated? What have they had to do? And how does your device compare to them? That's something we can do fairly quickly. Core and deeper diligence are for more mature companies and where you need a really substantive understanding of what your roadmap is, what your evidence plan is, and how does that relate to the pathway and the capital investment that you'll need to make. When do you need deeper diligence? Well, like I said, Series A and plus now, or situations where you have high risk, you should really do some deep diligence. An example of a scenario where you should look at manufacturability is one particular startup was using uranium from decommissioned bombs for their development of their device. Supply chain problem became a terminal problem for this company. There's only a limited amount of material that you can use from decommissioned bombs for this particular device. So you had a supply problem that was encompassed in manufacturing. The regulatory pathway was fine, the timeline was effective, the clinical plan was well established, but you were looking at an operational problem. So those are the instances where you have a high degree of risk, higher expectations from a company where you should be looking deeper for these types of issues. And we'll look at a couple of examples. Why would you need some additional deeper diligence? Well, there's a lot of areas that if you do not have a robust evidence plan can result in very extended delays. For example, if you've correctly identified your pathway, you've correctly identified your claims, you know exactly where you want to be, but you haven't built the evidence plan that the FDA is expecting, a human factors study can put you back 3 to 6 months. Having to redo biocompatibility, bench testing, or clinical evidence, they can put you back significantly. Cybersecurity is one that we've seen recently. Cyber companies or software medical device companies perform their cybersecurity. They do a fantastic job. They submit, and then the FDA says, you did this 2 years ago. This isn't valid. I need you to redo cybersecurity. And now you have a 6 to 9 month hold or a pause because you haven't appropriately identified what the FDA expectations are for each of these categories. In this scenario, you would need some deeper diligence. Another item to consider in your roadmap and in your timeline is the FDA review clock versus reality. So as we know, the 510K program from the FDA's perspective has a timeline of 90 days and the de novo program of 150 days. But I did a quick analysis of just 2025, and the median review time for a 510K was 126 days. The median review time of a de novo was almost 300 days. So having realistic timelines and validating your targets' timelines with reality is something that can help you appropriately use your investment capital. What is the delay usually? We mentioned at the beginning, AI holds. So when you haven't correctly anticipated the data or the evidence burden from the FDA, that can result in significant holds. And that's where your timeline and your runway start become a huge factor. So how do you factor everything in? It's good to have a good scoring rubric to prioritize your regulatory risk. Something that we've done is we've developed a rubric scoring based on some of the standard approaches of regulatory diligence and factoring in all of the near misses or sometimes complete misses that we've seen with our clients. Like I said, with over 50 startups that we've worked together and 50 plus years of combined experience, we've seen quite a bit of failures. This doesn't have to be your particular prioritization or scoring rubric, but this is something that we found very helpful. We look at the severity of the risk, and we use a risk-based approach for this. How much risk or how much value can be destroyed if this risk materializes? For example, how much value is destroyed if the FDA disagrees with your pathway? You're not 510K, you're a de novo. How much value is destroyed? Well, it's fairly easy to understand the amount of time that you've just added to your timeline, and it's not too hard to estimate how much value you've or additional capital requirements you'll need based on just that one decision. So that's good to score. Another item is what is the likelihood of enforcement? There are some guidelines and procedures that the FDA has utilized for many years. And there are some recent guidelines that we'll talk a little bit more about a little later, in particular to the wellness guidance. So what is the likelihood that this will result in an AI hold or possible enforcement action? That's good to score as well. And what is the opportunity cost? Time, cash, what is the fixed cost of this risk materializing? These are some of the factors that we utilize when providing a risk scoring for regulatory diligence. So let's look at some examples now, and let's dig in a little bit and see what the result is of a poor regulatory diligence or performing poor regulatory diligence. And let's look at some case studies as well. The first red flag: selling first without understanding the regulatory implications. So let's look at that. Disclaimers rarely get you out of enforcement from an FDA's perspective. With the updated wellness guidance that just came out this week, there's some more leeway. You can't just disclaim everything, even now with the updated guidelines. Entering unauthorized markets without fully understanding the regulatory implications, that is a huge risk. So let's take a look at this. Our first case, and the case studies that we'll be analyzing today, publicly available information. We decided to use that versus past or current clients that we work with. But the same scenarios that you'll see here are the same scenarios that happen at seed level, Series A. And these companies, although more mature, you should have seen these regulatory red flags coming even more so. But we'll take a look at these. So the Owlet Smart Sock started distribution in 2021. They very quickly received a warning letter from the FDA saying that they are marketing a device without the appropriate clearance. This is a sock that is used mainly for newborns, and I can tell you because I've used it myself. It's used for newborns, and it's used to track the oxygenation of the blood as well as heart rate. And when those become alarming or beyond certain thresholds, it alarms the parent, it alarms your phone to notify you that there could be something wrong with your baby's breathing. Without a doubt, very important device. I own it, we've used it, very fantastic device, but it wasn't cleared through the FDA. So of course they received a warning letter, sales were halted. They, according to SEC filings, they had to take a $23 million contra revenue adjustment just to account for all of the returns that had to be made. And it took them about 2 years to get a de novo authorization for the Dream Sock. So time, money consequence, reputational hit. Why? Because they didn't perform the regulatory diligence, truly understanding the FDA's expectations. Now, does this mean that the regulatory team in-house didn't look at this? Well, we don't know. I can't tell you that for a factor, for certain. What I can tell you is that there are instances where the regulatory team can make a recommendation, but sometimes the founding team or the C-suite may not accept it. From an investment standpoint, if you have an independent review of this type of risk, it can save you from making decisions that maybe in this case, it wouldn't have affected the investment decision. Regardless, it should have been an easy red flag to catch, especially understanding the wellness FDA guidance at the time. What would we have done to mitigate this particular device? We would have recommended a pre-submission, an initial dialogue with the FDA to understand their expectations. You would have saved yourself a two-year gap in sales of your first and foremost product. What's another red flag? Another red flag that we've seen: non-medical services, non-medical companies extending operations into potentially medical territory. So what happens there is that you're completely missing a regulatory team, regulatory structure. Your claims can change overnight. And from an investor focus, you should be looking for some sort of regulatory strategy memo for this particular device. Let's look at this in a little bit more detail. This is the case of 23andMe. 23andMe, as we understand, providing genetic testing meant initially for ancestry reports, raw data, but they expanded their offerings into genetic tests that gave you an indication of your propensity to develop certain diseases. Fantastic product, works amazingly, but they marketed without FDA clearance or approval. So again, they received a warning letter. We don't have an understanding of the business impact or the scope. What we can see from the public record is that it was a 2-year duration between warning letter and first market clearance. What happened here? A company that wasn't used to performing medical assessment, regulatory assessments per the FDA lens, claimed or drifted their claims into a higher risk category with different products and didn't do that diligence appropriately. We've seen this time and time again from specifically a lot of companies that are used to digital companies that are coming from Silicon Valley space, from the IT space, the tech space, jumping into medical devices or things that could become medical devices and carry a higher risk and not doing that diligence correctly. We would have done a complete analysis here, would have saved yourself 2 years of lost sales. Red flag number 3, when claims exceed device. Sometimes your claim, or when claims exceed the evidence that you have. I had this particular example, debated whether I should remove it based on current situation that has happened recently, but we'll talk about it anyway. Blood pressure insights. When this came out, and the warning letter from the FDA came out, most, if not the majority of regulatory professionals would have told you this was a big red flag. You should have seen this coming. Other devices had very similar devices that had to be cleared by the FDA. Measured blood pressure insights, including daily systolic and diastolic estimations. Whoop was using them from a fitness and wellness perspective. However, the FDA concluded that it was inherently tied to diagnosing hypo and hypertension. So what happened? Well, they received the warning letter. Whoop maintained that it was a wellness feature. Some level of conversation ensued. And just this week, the FDA commissioner cited the new wellness regulation that would allow Whoop specifically, because they included an example that in the updated guidance that explicitly describes Whoop's product and blood pressure estimation for a wellness device. So in the context of what we're understanding regulatory due diligence, a regulatory professional would have likely or should have communicated the high risk potential of this device and the high risks that it was receiving a warning letter and receiving injunctions and seizures and enforcement action by the FDA and other government agencies. But in this particular case, the work of Whoop managed to change the overall guidelines, where the guidelines are now more inclusive to devices such as this used for health estimation. In normal regulatory scenarios, this probably would not happen. In the regulatory landscape that we are in today, it was a high risk, but it was a high reward. And independently whether you agree or disagree with it, this is good news to many, many companies. But it's good to understand from an investment perspective, at least the risk that was involved in making this type of decision. The last red flag we'll analyze are startups that have relatively simple products, but hidden complexity creates high evidence burden. Specifically, digital products, cybersecurity, interoperability can create heavy evidence burdens that can be hidden. And in these types of scenarios, it's good to understand from a deep diligence perspective exactly what your timeline should look like. So these are some examples that we've gone through. What are some fixes to understand the risk here? Well, depending on the investment stage that your target is at, there are some relatively cheap fixes early on that can help you avoid huge potential downside in the future. For example, from a pre-seed or prototype perspective, understanding your claims and starting your document control, understanding your pathway, that's easy fix. And it'll help you save a lot of money in the future. Validation or seed level, understanding the frozen design, having a good understanding of your evidence burden that will be required to get to market, that's a relatively easy fix. And for higher or more mature devices or startups, having a very thought out, detailed plan and looking for any hidden risk within the engineering documents. Those are cheaper fixes early on, and they can save a lot of time. which result in sales, of course. So how do you do this analysis? It's good to have a rubric and understand the rubric. And as investors, without a doubt, you have rubrics and spreadsheets and everything that factor into the decision of understanding risk for your investment and a go, no-go scenario. But we've developed a rubric that's specifically for regulatory risk. We're happy if you'd like to, you can put it in the chat or send an email or note. Happy to share that with you so you can take a look at the different levels of diligence depending on the different approaches, the different maturity of your startup. So if you only remember three things, what should you remember? Claims come first. Understand your claims, what you will say, what you won't say, what the target will or won't say. Understand what those claims are, and how they relate to the technology, first and foremost. That will many times dictate your pathway. Two, even with the updated wellness guidance, wellness and disclaimers are not a complete shield. So having somebody on your team that understands where the line is and where the gray is so that you can quantify that risk, that is essential. And last, diligence is leverage. Spending a little bit of the check size on regulatory diligence, as we've seen, it can save some significant time delays and some significant capital investments in the future. Thank you very much. I think, John, I don't know if you'll be opening for questions, but this is the presentation that we had. Again, pleasure being able to discuss something that is near and dear to our hearts.
Thanks, Ery. Yeah. So does anybody have any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and speak up if you do. One interesting thing that I thought was kind of interesting side note you gave was about the manufacturability of the device, especially with the atomic bomb parts. Do you often spot issues when you're doing due diligence where you spot something and you wonder, how the heck are they going to find a manufacturer that is FDA cleared who can actually build this thing? Do you see that a lot?
When we're doing deep diligence and when we're analyzing the manufacturing, it's not that they can't find a manufacturer. It's usually that they don't understand the lead time to get certain manufacturing capabilities online. For example, if it's a plastic molded part that is unique, that can take 6 months to a year just to build the molds and multiple millions of dollars just to have the molds to be able to begin some level of manufacturing, even if it's not fully automated. So usually it's that. Back in the day, in my role with BD, one of my roles was to travel internationally, determine the abilities of certain manufacturers to produce at scale what was needed. So sometimes the scalability is a factor. Sometimes you have manufacturers that can scale for a certain amount, but they haven't done the due diligence that with the growth that they had expected, they can keep the same manufacturer. And sometimes that leads to issues.
Yeah, that seems like a can of worms, actually. It's outside of regulatory, but is pretty interesting. What about AI startups? I see a lot of founders that see what LLMs can do and see Hugging Face and all these models for computer vision and machine learning and large language models and seem very intent on building what looks to me like a medical device without having any sort of controls or regulatory experience whatsoever. Do you have any advice for those founders? And obviously they can use your rubric that you've shared here when they're trying to figure out, how do I build a team that will help me as, like you're saying, a Silicon Valley based AI founder to actually have a sellable medical device in the end? How do I build that team?
Yeah, I mean, I think the advice that we've given previously to founders is exactly what I described here, is really understanding your overall product roadmap. So many times when, especially early stage founders, the Silicon Valley mentality, move fast and break things, doesn't translate very well to medical devices, because you can either move fast and break things and start over, or you can move a little bit slower deliberately and get there quicker. So general recommendation would be to really understand what it is you're building and understand the regulatory constraints around which you have to build. And even, for example, in Whip's case, I'm sure there was some level of discussion in terms of the regulatory risk that existed. And for them, it paid off. That is much, much more the exception versus the rule.
Yeah, that's rare.
Many more times you will be shut down and the FDA will be immovable. I haven't seen a scenario that ended well for anybody where the founder told the FDA, thank you for your advice, but we're not going to follow it. But it did. Understanding what it is, what are the regulatory bounds for what you're trying to build, and understanding the risk that's associated with it. Today's regulatory landscape is different than it was even a few years ago. There might be some room to play, but understanding the risk is always what we promote.
Yeah.
I may have a question, if that's okay.
Please.
Yes, maybe two even. I think there's two different topics. So first of all, sometimes the regulatory landscape may actually be really well defined, but the clinical diligence is really bad. And how do you normally combine these activities to, because I've seen those happening as well, that everything looks in place and then you do this have a thorough look at the statistics and they could have been better. How do you normally in practice combine those activities? Do you do it yourself? Do you have partners?
Yeah, good question. Yes, clinical is a huge portion of it. And so what we recommend is always, before you perform clinical, run it through the FDA, through a pre-submission, whether that's a digital product that you need to run clinical validation on, you're doing validations on images, or a prospective clinical study. So internally, we do have a clinical expert. She's a medical doctor used to running clinical trials. We also partner with a clinical trial firm for added expertise. But clinical is a huge aspect, and unfortunately, that's somewhere where we see a lot of repetition because, like I said, we meet with fantastic founders, brilliant scientists, brilliant medical doctors, specialists in their field. They have done clinical studies from an academic, scientific viewpoint, which is not always necessarily, as you mentioned, the FDA's viewpoint, or the statistics aren't well defined. The endpoints are not the exact endpoints for the device. So you have to repeat the study. Our recommendation, always, as much as you can, unless you understand the risk and want to move forward, run your clinical study by the FDA prior to running it.
And then there's another one that is when you're just outside the medical device, especially now with all the wellness and the DHDs, but you're working with pharma. You're in this void of you're not regulated in that sense, but the expectations from the customer are huge. They're even higher than when you're a medical device. That's very difficult to meet then expectations of the regulated customers. Are you also moving into this field a bit or less?
We don't work too much with pharma, other than combination devices that are led from a device perspective that may have some pharmaceutical component. Understandably, the CDER requirements, the CDER branch of the FDA requirements are different than the CDRH requirements. But when there's collaboration, that's where we work. And there's a lot of gray areas in what you're talking about in the wellness devices. There's a lot of gray areas, and just understanding the risk and what are the potentials to go from an investment standpoint and from a founder standpoint, I think that's sometimes the best you can do, other than engaging directly with the FDA and asking those questions specifically in like a pre-IND or a pre-submission.
Thanks. Generally, thanks for that good presentation.
Hey, Ery, it's Michelle Strong. How are you?
Oh, hey, Michelle. Good to see you.
Nice to see you too. That was a really great 101 overview. Thank you for going through all that. Do you mind just sharing a quick overview of the recent changes FDA has put in place for health and wellness, just to get a sense for what has changed in literally the last week or so?
Yeah, definitely. Previous stance from a health and wellness perspective was that devices that reasonably foreseeable misuse from a medical standpoint did not meet the low risk requirements for a wellness device and therefore had to be regulated from a medical device perspective. The Whoop example is a great example of something that was before it was in the black, now it's white. Where previously, the FDA always characterized blood pressure as a higher risk biomarker than all of the other biomarkers that are wellness devices. Heart rate, for example, sleep, all those other biomarkers, specifically because of the risk for users to change their blood pressure medication, which is reasonably foreseeable, misuse. That FDA previously had put into a higher risk category. Whoop's argument was that there should be a wellness case for blood pressure where it's just used for fitness devices for general health and wellness, and FDA relented. The exact mechanics of why that happened, I'm not entirely sure. But what I do know is that from publicly available data, the founder did speak directly with Secretary Kennedy, and the FDA commissioner came out with a statement saying something almost describing Whoop's device to a T and saying why that shouldn't be regulated. That wellness policy update that came out, the regular approach to new policies like that is to have a public review of the updated guidance and public discussion of the updated guidance. That didn't happen in this case. It was typically a 2-year guidance update went by in a few months. That's a different regulatory landscape. In general now, the updated wellness guidance says that as long as you disclaim that it is intended for fitness, general health reasons, not citing any medical diagnostics, any medical disease. As long as you do not cite medical diseases, even if you prompt the user to look for medical guidance based on certain conditions, that is still wellness. As long as the technology doesn't create an added risk. So for example, electrostimulation to the brain. So the technology has a potential risk, even if it's used for like, oh, we're electrically stimulating your brain to reduce stress. Even though it's a wellness claim, the technology adds an added risk. So that's where the line is redrawn. You have to disclaim, and as long as your technology is non-invasive, it doesn't create any new risks to the user, even if it prompts the user to seek medical attention, you are now a wellness device. So definitely increase the goalpost there substantially.
Got it. And a great example of going through a pre-sub to validate.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Any other questions?
Nope.
No more questions. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ery. If people want to get your help evaluating their claims or due diligence on the regulatory side, how do they get a hold of you?
You can find me on LinkedIn, or you can take a look at our website, which is apsiscg.com. Thank you very much, John. I appreciate these summits always.
You're welcome. Thanks very much for coming on and giving a great presentation. And thanks to everyone who asked questions.
Thank you very much as well.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.